So I think this afternoon session was an interesting exercise in linking the past to the future. We speak about ICT, the cultural heritage that is intangible, but whatever is in the past also points to the future, and you brought it out in different ways and aspects. And the law also is one way of looking towards the future, but as you clearly told us, you know, it's not always the best way. And I think the Visionario opens up the many possibilities in the future. And I think in your case study, what I found very interesting is also the element of past dependency. And we see it in evolutionary processes very often. What happens, and this may be a contingent happening in the beginning, determines what happens later on. So I think these are interesting strands here, and I had no time to talk, but he will talk now. And I invite questions, unless you want to comment here, otherwise we open up to the audience. So I invite questions addressed to the panel as a whole or to individual speakers. Yes, please, here on the right, if you can bring the microphone here.
Thank you. It's been a really interesting day for me. I'm not in anything related to heritage or arts. I'm just plain Singaporean. And I wasn't sure what to expect when I came this morning. So Prof. Wang was very good. But after that, with this morning on innovation and diminishing returns, and then this afternoon, I was starting to get really depressed because it seems very complex and it seems very bureaucratic. All the things that everybody's been talked about. So I just want to make that one comment that I don't know if I'm right. Maybe by tomorrow when we start talking about food and dance, you know, I will pick up a little bit. But I do have a question for the last speaker, for Kevin. National Library here had a very good, sorry, not the last speaker is, Dr. Cheong. We had a very good exhibit at the National Library on cartography and maps of Singapore. And I said, so where are the red light districts over time? And the response I got was that we don't officially track those, we don't show those, and we don't want to show those. So if I take your last example of Tiong Bahru, and I thought that was really interesting how you said, was this a place that was replicated across? Would you then use that same framework on Bugis Junction now and say, you know, maybe that was a mistake that we destroyed that, because that was a blueprint of a really good red light district. You know, that is now in Geylang, there's food, there's play, there's entertainment, there's commerce, there's all that. And we shouldn't, in hindsight, we shouldn't have destroyed that. That is a blueprint for Geylang and other places. So yeah, just make it kind of positive again, because I'm trying not to get upset with all the bureaucracy that is required in heritage, and in the name of accountability and all that. I find that just so bureaucratic and so difficult to deal with. That you know, we're trying to do all the right things around heritage, and maybe at some point this conference could address how you want to simplify just the processes of managing heritage projects and all that. But my question is really for you around red light districts.
Yes. So obviously the Singapore government's position on red light district is that it is a necessity. Especially in the early days, because if you don't have those, then maybe the sailors will run amok in the city center. So there is, so they would rather have a designated red light district where the prostitutes actually undergo regular health checks to keep the kind of situation under control. Now, if you ask today, do we really still need it? Because actually now the sailors don't have time to go for shore leave. So they won't ever leave Tuas Harbour. Maybe it is possible to do away with this. But then again, there is the question of boogies. So if you take away that kind of human interaction, then boogies loses its characteristics. So are we willing to also live with that kind of sacrifice? So it's a hard decision to make. And fundamentally, ultimately, all decisions are political in nature. So the leaders make them. We can only offer up evidence. So we can, of course, if all the data is available, we can show to them what is the most common kind of social interaction that happens in this particular area, how they are connected in an ecosystem. If you remove this particular practice, then the rest will fall apart. Maybe that's something that they can do to actually completely eliminate red light districts in Singapore. I don't know, but that's a decision that not for me to make. But so only evidence that we present forward. So in the end, after presenting the evidence, if the policymakers still want to go ahead and do something against the evidence, then we know that we have done so. So then that means we are ready to pay the cost. So that is also part of the possibilities. So we don't always have to follow recommendations or evidence from the ground. We can always do something different, as it's done in the past many, many times. So there are people, there are leaders who decided that, okay, we are going to do this. So this is something new. We've never done this before, but then they did it.
Okay. I want to write the visionario for that.
But you are not going to tell us about it now. Okay,
very quickly, I think if we look at the instance of Bugis, like many other parts of that very central part of Singapore, the demolition took place a long time ago as part of the whole urban redevelopment. At that time, they called it urban renewal system, right? Only much later, when they set up URA, did it become urban redevelopment. But at first, it was really about renewal. In other words, renewal, get rid of everything that looks old, dirty, and looks like they're about to collapse. And then, build something afresh. And in fact, Bugis is a complete fake, right? You go inside Bugis Square or whatever it is, all these sort of shop houses, they're actually not the original. I mean, they have the old streets and all that still exist. So we lost them. The point I think that ought to be made, and I think Siew Ann and Andretti's model actually may be quite useful, and I really like to see more of how you can actually employ it, is in this thing which we are now advocating called heritage impact assessment. In other words, before we take down anything, we should actually try preemptively to study to see whether or not heritage is going to be adversely impacted. Now, of course, how then do you weigh? What factors do you weigh in terms of heritage impact versus, sort of development, cost, etc., etc.? That is still in its infancy, but this is something that's being pushed right now. We lost the opportunity in the 80s, right up to even the 90s. But now I think increasingly after we lost National Library, we lost National Theatre, we lost Chinatown too, even though the buildings are there. Because the state had a very, very clear perspective of what they wanted. They want something that looked good. And then after a little while, they realized it looked a bit too sterile. Then they adopted a model that was purely economic in nature, in which case what happens is that it gets rent-seeking, and then eventually you get the same type of shop. So every other shop is a souvenir shop or a 7-Eleven or a McDonald's or massage bar, massage parlor or something like that. You end up getting a certain sameness because only these guys can afford the high rent, right? So I think we've gone over different phases in the development, made lots of mistakes, but I think now with greater consciousness and with more tools, there's an opportunity for us actually to not make the same mistakes. We could still make mistakes, but at least we make it knowingly,
I think you also bring up something that has not been mentioned this morning, namely the learning process that is ongoing. And we learn from examples as the ones you cited, but we also learn from processes that do not work out, etc. And I think this is an important component. There is a hand up there in the last row.
Yeah, thank you very much for the panel. This question, before I enter into this question, I think I offer an answer for the lady there. Red light district is not necessary because everybody can go to the cyberspace. And that's everywhere. So continuing to this, this question is directed to Dr. Kelvin Tan. It's about digital identity. I'm a digital native by practice, so my entire life is digital. So my question is, how do you then account for this digital identity as an heritage, tangible, intangible, etc., because I'm a cross-border in cyberspace. So in the local context, in the global context, I'd like to hear your perspective, say in the words of law, because I'm very interested in that field. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand your question. How do we account for digital heritage?
No, how do you account for someone who is a digital native by definition or year born or by practice? Okay, so whatever that person do, the contribution in the digital area, be it whatever, is a very big domain. And that kind of heritage, because if it has an influence across the world, so does the local, in the local context, by law, do they take this as a heritage or isn't a heritage? Because globally, this is a heritage.
Well, I think first of all, it's...
Because all the articles that I pay full attention to what you say, all the 11, 12, 13, 14, and I don't know what else you have. So...
yeah, I'm not quite sure I can answer that question for the simple reason is that technology races way ahead of law, and law
that we know.
And law very often can't catch up. And the thing is, it opens up a number of questions as to what you consider to be so-called heritage in the digital domain. The law only has a few answers to this. You can only protect them if you can identify them, and if you can identify it, it is necessarily territorial in most instances. But the moment you say it's cross borders, then it requires the international community to come together and do something, and that's not always easy. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you. The law has nothing to say about this.
Because in the digital world, you have only one identity. The identity is your IP address. And this change or doesn't change. So identity theft is a crime which is very active now, and it will become worse in the years to come. Therefore, this thing is very important, and that's the reason why I raised this question.
Okay, thank you. We have more hands. I take here on the left side, right side, and then we move to your same row.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question to Professor Ronis. First of all, thank you for your visioning development. It was very brilliant, I think. My question is, since we are striving to measure everything and to put under the regulation, as we see also with the speakers today, everything, don't you think that this striving and this thinking that everything is measurable with the data goes in the opposite direction of these infinite numbers of potential futures?
Yes, I do. And that's very difficult for me to say because I am a physicist. But I refer to myself as a recovering physicist. I think that part of the problem is that we think that things are not important unless they are measurable. And as I would assume many people would agree, sometimes the most important things are not measurable. They are intangible. They are difficult to get your arms around. They are, in fact, complex. And complexity in the natural world, as we heard in our last lecture, I didn't give you that lecture, really means that they are nonlinear. Frequently, cause and effect are not trackable. They are not predictable, as most human behavior is not. It may be measurable through probabilities at best. But in the natural world, we now know that if you know some things, you may not be able, because of natural laws, to even understand other things. You know, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says if you know one thing, you may not be able to know anything else about it. So I think that the reality is we have to take our focus off from time to time of thinking that we know anything. I think we have to be much more concerned about the questions we ask of one another, and that because we don't know, we have to be into learning what's going on in the system. How can, you can't control a complex system, but you can influence it, but only if you know a lot about it, which means you have to get into learning. The learning processes are absolutely paramount, and those who will be successful in this century have to be into learning processes, because we do not know the answers. Frequently, there are no single answers, but there are questions, and the better your questions, and the more you learn about the world, the more likely you'll be successful.
Thank you. Thank you. In the same row on that side. If you could pass it on to the gentleman over there.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was really good. I have a question with Dr. Cheong regarding the methodology. It seems to me that you based it on a place. So there's this graph that you had, the image that you had, that there's a tree, there's the tempo and the ICH as a practice. But do you think that the methodology can work if it's just not involving place? For example, as an oral tradition, as a language, as a dance that is not rooted in a certain specific location?
Well, actually, most dances and theaters, they were built around stories that occur at a certain place. Obviously, theater can the dance and the theater can move around, but through the backdrop, you can kind of identify with the original place where it happens. Now, how strongly, of course, people in the audience identify with the original place, I cannot tell. But I think maybe that's not what you're asking.
Yeah,
right?
but let's say if it's a language, a dying language, how does the methodology address that concern? Because you're covering a whole aspect of intangible cultural heritage,
right,
not just a certain aspect of it.
Okay, so language itself is a complex system all on its own.
Yeah.
So I think it would be too hard if we just do the language, fully understand the language as well as fully understand heritage. But we can pick stuff from language. For example, certain phrases that are common in this particular kind of social interaction but uncommon in others. We could use those as markers to distinguish, identify different interaction patterns. For example, dialect groups constitute different interaction patterns, and they are also frequently mixed in with other non-linguistic practices that are distinct. For let's say between the Hokkien and the Cantonese, it's not just the dialect that is different, but certain practices are also different. So these markers can be used to as alternative data for measuring replication rates, transmission rates, and transformation rates. We do know that because we have a complexity conference here in NTU every year, we do know from a linguist that actually the language, the Cantonese language itself is changing all the time in Hong Kong. Even simple words, they are pronounced, the younger generation is pronouncing it different ways compared to the older generation. So you can measure that, and then you can, at the same time, so as you measure the rate of change in the language, you can at the same time measure rate of change in other kind of social practices and see whether they are the same, whether one of them gives you information on the other.
I think the question was about modeling in general and being tied too much to a place. This was the example you gave.
Yeah,
it was a model that was tied to place. And the question was, what about modeling of processes that are not tied as much to a particular place? But I think you gave an answer. So in network analysis, it's less tied to a place. I mean, you can still say there is a place somewhere, but it plays less of a role in your models. We had a question over here, and then I think over there.
Oh, yeah, thank you. This brings me back to a question I would have liked to put before lunch about the tensions between mapping and understanding. So we had Bertocci making all these 3D representations, but Dr. Cheong as well speaking about mapping phenomena. And I couldn't prevent listening very carefully to your description of different types of art being qualified with your system. I mean, you called it qualitative assessment. And according to that, I'm trying to quote you, but I forgot most of the words. Some arts take more time to be produced and so are more valuable or more deserve more attention in the preservation, etc., than other arts because they take less time, etc. This brings, of course, back the discussion to centuries of debates on the arts and the senses and the hierarchization, etc., etc. And in the end, you would need such an expertise to answer to such questions that you cannot map before understanding, and you cannot understand before mapping. And so you're in a hermeneutic circle. Being an Argentine, I have to think about Borges' map of China, which is as big as China. So how important, necessary, or possible is the map?
So I understand now that I've stepped on a landmine. Yeah. So I think maybe Andrea will unstep on a landmine.
So the question is, if you need all the expertises to produce a map, then do you need the map?
Yeah, maybe I'm not answering to your question, but I can make a consideration, which is the consideration that Stefano, Siew Ann, and I made when we were in 2014 in a meeting in Beijing, and it was about mapping and understanding and interpretation. And essentially we started from a basic consideration. So we live in the so-called digital era, which is, we can better understand it if we speak French, is numeric. So numbers. And the challenge is to transform something in numbers, is mapping. Mapping is transferring data from a set into another, the basic definition of mapping. And the two sets are our challenge, because in order to transfer data from a set into another, you need a reason to do it. It is a first step in the interpretation. After, maybe going to Borges' consideration is that today we can have the one-to-one map without laughing at it, and it's not a joke. We have the one-to-one map. But are we able to use it? As humans, no. But as humans, we are not able to see the stars, but using a telescope, we become able. So we have devices that amplify our 5 senses. And in this sense, we have what we call machine learning, AI, that help us in working in this mapping. It is our present challenge in our research project, is about this mapping and understanding and interpretation. I think it's not the answer because we don't have the answer, but we are working around the problem, yes.
Just a footnote to that. When you say we are in the âge numérique, to use your French quotation, the point is, who is we?
So is the people that use devices, computers that don't rely anymore in, let's say, I'm tempted to say in old media, but it's not so easy. Maybe telling a story is better, but it's a 2-second story. So think at what Plato wrote when he was describing the change in between oral and written transmission of knowledge. And he was in between. He didn't really understand what was going on, but he called himself a friend of the wise people, a philosopher. We don't really know in which situation we are, but we know that we are in a change, in a dramatic change in the transmission of knowledge. Maybe it is the computer, maybe it's something else, but we have this strong feeling that we are in a dramatic change in the transmission of knowledge, and we need new ontologies to do it. And Plato understood it perfectly. He needed new ontologies in order to work in the written word. And he was very aware that he was losing, today we would say, data and information. He was losing data and information because the transmission from master to disciple was enormously more effective and important. And he knew that writing down, it was something very loosey and basic. And I think in our panel today, we realize that transforming intangible cultural heritage, or even tangible, as Stefano was demonstrating, in numbers, we are losing an enormous quantity of data. But it's our limit, this one. Because with the other part of the data, and Plato was aware of that, with the part of the data that he was losing, he couldn't work on it in any way. So we are losing a lot, but let's think at what we can capture and how we can use it in a visionary perspective, as Sheila was saying. So we built up these panels at the conference in order to have a narrative and a continuity. And I think now you are aware of it. And Dan, and I close with this, Dan was saying, I didn't know exactly why I was here. But at these conferences, it is what happened every time. People are coming here, giving a talk, and they say, I don't know why I'm here. But at the end, not only they understand why they were here, but they built up networks in which they look at their own disciplines in a dramatically different way. And we have a very good feedback in that after this conference, and hopefully after this one as well.
Thank you for this. Just one word. Plato's your perfect example. The point is to zoom in and zoom out in order to avoid our tools to prevent us from understanding what we want to understand. So numbers to understand dance or music. This is a very important question, and I think this is what puts us all together here. Thank you.
Since we are discussing, you started with maps and mapping, and this reminded me of this very nice Italian story of Marco Polo going to talk to the great Khan, and every night they play chess together. And then the Khan wants to know about cities in the West that he has never seen, and Marco Polo describes cities, etc. But the end and the gist of the story is that Marco Polo admits, whenever I speak of one of the cities that I'm describing to the Khan, I'm speaking about Venice. So there's a map in the head, and we all have our Venice maps in the head, and so do the people working on in the computational physics. They also have a map of Venice. It's a different kind of map. And talking to each other, we are trying to find out what are the maps in the head that we have, and how do they compare, and eventually, how can we construct a map that we all recognize together. There was a question from Susan, please.
Yes. I have to say that I feel a little bit in tune with our commentator over here and with Pedro. I really think it's fantastic that we're working out new tools, as long as we remember them as tools. They're methods along with a whole range of other methods and tools in our toolkits. And one of the things I would say about your example that you gave in your shift example is that the missing qualitative data, I would have thought, was actually talking to the people who live in that area and finding out why they like living in that area and why they want to be there. Because what we've got to remember is that the reason that we even have heritage laws is because communities demand them. People are the reason why we have a need to protect our heritage, because if no one cared, it wouldn't matter and there wouldn't be any laws. So the problem is that the whole system then gets hijacked by the bureaucracy, as pointed out, and I guess all of us working in there feel that tension, And all of us have got to do our ways to subvert that system. So it's a really difficult, it's a complex situation in itself where we are part of a system, but we also should be remembering that we should be fighting the edges of that, pushing it out all the time. And I understand that's what this complex process is doing, is trying to push the edges by finding something different. But I think there is a risk that we take people out of heritage and then really we're just doing something that might be, you know, intellectually interesting to us, but not about heritage at all.
You want to respond?
Yes. Actually, I recently read an article written by a Chinese anthropologist. She does ethnography in Chinese cities of the immigrants. And she says, the title of the article is Big Data Needs Thick Data. So thick data, by thick data, she means ethnographic studies of a small number of people. You follow them for years, and then you write accounts of their lives. And then you match those against big data. But there is a problem here, because the thing here is the big data is collected very differently from ethnographic data. There is a gap in between. So I personally understand that there is this gap, and we need to fill it. So in the context of Tiong Bahru, certainly if we go around interviewing residents of Tiong Bahru to ask them, how frequently do you do this, and what is the most common activity you go around doing in your neighborhood, we will find out whether the story that I tell is true or not. Most likely it is, but it will be good that there is verification. And then the question would be how to go beyond this small sample group of people that you can actually afford to follow very closely and fill in the gaps with the rest of the big data.
I mean, you are discussing now the tension that exists between qualitative and quantitative. And the kind of thick description goes back to Clifford Geertz, who was one of the first anthropologists to coin the term thick description. And what he meant was this ethnographic data as being part of the way how we understand the world. But if you want to work to close the gap, I think a new methodology is also needed in order to have a reiteration between the people who do the quantitative stuff and the ones who do the ethnographic stuff. It's not enough to say, you know, there's this part and that part. The two will never meet unless you set up a situation where people can actually talk to each other. And then you go through the next round. So each part starts to appreciate what is it the others are offering and are complementing what we are doing. And this may be an arduous process because you have to learn to appreciate what the other brings to it. But I think it's the only way how you can ever hope to release the tension and bridge the gap. We will take one more question and then we will have our coffee break.
She's saying
no more questions. Karen says no. So we will have a coffee break. Thank you very much for your lively participation. Thanks to Karen.